Hello, art lovers. This is Gordy Grundy with ArtReportToday.com, your worldwide arts news platform. Along with the great Doppelhaus Press, we would like to welcome you to what I believe will be a fascinating and entertaining discussion. Now, if any of you have a question for our speakers, please feel free to send us a chat, and we will answer those questions after the presentation. Our host today is Professor Antoinette LaFarge, an artist and writer with a special interest in speculative fiction and alternative histories. Today we are here to discuss her new book, Sting in the Tail, Art, Hoax, and Provocation. She's been published internationally with her essays in the Art Journal, Leonardo, the MIT Press, and the Oxford University Press, among others. She has also authored a book on the early 20th century designer and innovator Louise Brigham, an incredible woman who is worthy of our study. Antoinette LaFarge is a professor of new media art at UC Irvine. Antoinette, I have a burning question before we get started. Is it true that you came up with the term fictive art?
Thanks for that intro, Gordy. Hi, everybody. I came up with the term in collaboration with Lisa Pat, with whom she was the first person with whom I had extended conversations in the late 90s and early 2000s about whether this might be a genre. So we tried all kinds of different names for this, and that's what we settled on as a working term. I'm going to be talking to Peter about his preferred term, superfiction, when we get to our actual conversation.
Fictive art. I love it. I mean, that's right up there with light and space and Finnish fetish. I love it. Pure Southern California. Thanks for that. Now, today the professor will be speaking with our guest, Dr. Peter Hill, an artist, writer, and independent curator who also appears in the book. Born in Glasgow, Scotland, Dr. Hill is joining us today from Australia, the island he calls home. Since the early 1970s, Peter has been creating what he now calls superfictions, art events that exist in the world between art installation and literary fiction. Such works have included the Museum of Contemporary Ideas. It's a venerable institution on New York's Swank Park Avenue, and it exists only through the pages of his fake press releases. Until COVID changed his plans, he was on a 4-year round-the-world lecture tour called Fake News and Superfictions. In 1973, he worked as a lighthouse keeper on 3 uninhabited islands off the west coast of Scotland. His book, Stargazing, Memoirs of a Young Lighthouse Keeper, was read on the BBC as a Book of the Week by actor David Tennant. Peter Hill is currently a professor at the Victorian College of the Arts, University of Melbourne. Welcome to you both. Now, Professor LaFarge, take it away.
Thank you very much. I've invited Peter here tonight because he is genuinely one of the pioneers of what I'm calling an entire genre, fictive art. His practice in this field goes back decades. And just as importantly to me, he was one of the very first people to theorize this field in his 2000 PhD thesis, which I hope we'll talk more about. So I am very happy to have him here. His oeuvre is enormous, and I can really not do it justice, but I did want to start by giving you guys a very small visual introduction to a few of his projects and works so that you have some visual mnemonics as our conversation goes forward. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen here. And am I right? You should now be seeing the first page of a PDF that I'm showing you guys. I hope.
Yep.
That's great. So Gordy mentioned the Museum of Contemporary Ideas, which dates all the way back to 1989. It's one of Peter's earlier projects, and he invented the museum and its billionaire benefactors, Alice and Bucky Cameron. At this time that he came up with this idea, he was publishing an art magazine, which, like all other art magazines, routinely received scads of press releases from other institutions, and he began to think about how much cheaper and simpler in certain ways it might be to build something entirely around press releases rather than trying to actually publish or build an institution out of concrete and bricks, a bricks and mortar institution. So the Museum of Contemporary Ideas has existed as an issuer of press releases about projects, installations, artists, the kind of classic news of the art world that you would expect. This is one of the very earliest press releases, and the significant portions of the art world took this seriously. They thought a real institution had been founded, and they were very excited about this. In fact, there was an article in one German magazine among the articles about this museum, for which Peter furnished, of course, all the imagery, the artists that were being shown, and why they were important. One result of this particular article is that the magazine's editor was asked to chair a debate to see if Germany could build a similar museum. So a completely invented idea got people thinking about doing something in the real world. Creating these kinds of ripple effects between the imaginary and the real has been one of Peter's long-term goals with his many projects. The Museum of Contemporary Ideas was very well thought out in certain ways. Peter even came up with a bar for the basement called Plastos Cave, where, of course, we can link drinking with thinking, which is what we all would like to do if thinking and drinking were possible at all hours of the day, I think. So this is an interesting example among the many in his complex world of invented things, where he's exploiting the power of logos and branding to suggest realness almost more powerfully than photographs could. If it's got this kind of graphic design behind it, it must be real. And he also, interestingly enough, was very early in creating a website for his Museum of Contemporary Ideas in the mid-1990s, when barely anybody was on the web yet. Even very few artists had gotten their fingers into the web. The Museum of Contemporary Ideas website, as you can see here, continues the architectural motif of a museum with basements and floors, and some of them are floors you would expect, like there's a museum shop, there's a press office, and so on, but some of them are things you would not expect to find in an average museum. The Encyclopedia of Superfictions near the top, for example, that's something called the Changing Room, all kinds of novel things. And as this no longer exists, but you can find it through the Wayback Machine. As you explore it, you discover that there's a much wider allowance of things under the museum umbrella than is ordinarily considered appropriate for museums, even the most adventurous museums. It's staked a claim to be the world's first global museum, and you could possibly make that argument given that it was on the web so early. Another one of his very long-running projects is the Art Fair Murders, a series of installations speculating on what might happen if someone were to go around murdering people at prominent art fairs. It is something like a novel in visual installments, and it is one that ropes in a number of Peter's non-existent artists or fictive personas, depending on how you want to look at it, in various roles. And Peter has a lot of fictional artists. He has invented individual artists with their own practices, like Herbert Sherman and Hal Jones. He's invented a number of groups, the Nouvelle Kunst faction, the Triplet Twins. The list goes on and on. I'm actually going to ask Peter to talk more about the Art Fair Murders, because it is a very unusual project in the way it's attempting to novelize the art experience. Peter creates swag too. Here you see a series of pens, souvenirs of the Art Fair Murders, of the Museum of Contemporary Ideas, and in the middle, Cameron Oil is the fictive company that that produced the fortune for the museum's founders, the Camerons. The Camerons also funded a non-existent art prize, which has been announced at least once to my knowledge. Here is one of, here's Peter in character as one of his invented artists, Hal Jones, in front of one of Hal Jones's works. I'd like to note that the histories that interconnect Peter's many invented artists are very complex and often include interpersonal dramas of various kinds, some of them more traditional like love affairs. But for example, Hal Jones has actually vandalized a painting by another of Peter's artists, Herb Sherman. So the work of the artists expands, and the universe in which they relate to each other expands, and the way they relate to the rest of the world as if they were all real also is an ever-expanding set of arrangements. I wanted to take a minute to describe one piece in particular that I think really shows the complexity and layering in Peter's work, the Hermann Nitsch shower curtain. His unique inventiveness is really on show here. This piece originated in a photograph he took of the Viennese actionist, the real Viennese actionist, Hermann Nitsch. But he attributed this photograph to his invented art collective known as Made in Palestine. He then printed out the image and placed it inside a shower curtain package, creating a new assisted ready-made, which he attributed to yet another of his invented groups, Aloha. The Aloha piece featured in a Museum of Contemporary Ideas press release stating that Aloha had won that non-existent prize I mentioned for a ready-made work of art, a story that was picked up and circulated in the media as if it were just any other real prize. Then, in the next stage, the Hermann Nitsch shower curtain project morphed yet again, becoming what you see here, a wall-mounted artwork with the curtain with blood running down it, arranged to frame a large print of the original Nitsch photograph. What should be clear from this is that Peter is quite happy to work back and forth between the thin media of press releases and the thick media of actual art objects, each supporting the other in this universe of invention and deception. This is a slide of work by one of the other collectives that he invented, the fictional art team Made in Palestine, Made in Israel. It's a duo of artists who are both from Brooklyn, although one is of Jewish descent and one is of Palestinian descent. And in order to kind of model global conflict resolution on a small scale, they decided to alternate their collective name year to year. So one year, everything they produce comes under the sign of Made in Palestine, and the next year, everything is under the sign of Made in Israel. What they produce are photographs of real people in the art world doing various things at work, at play, casually, formally, mostly informally, as in the images I've seen. And they're presented as Cibachrome prints and as light boxes. So I speculate, I haven't asked Peter about this, but I speculate that this might be a very nice way to capture his own photographs of art world people that he interacts with over the years and turn them into artworks for the group that has the specific aesthetic that suits the use of these particular kinds of images. You'll note here another appearance of the Hermann Nitsch. This is the group that he originally attributed the Hermann Nitsch image to, from which the shower curtain project was eventually made for Aloha. Peter's second museum that I know about, there may be others, is the Museum of Doubt. And this is Peter in front of it in one of its installations. This is one of his ways of pushing back against the certainty of ignorance that seems at time to be taking over today's world. I'm hoping to get him to talk a little bit more about the Museum of Doubt. It's one of the projects I know least about in his oeuvre. And here we have a painting by Stickleback, another of Peter's invented artists, a recent one, if I understand it correctly, who offers pushback of another kind. Stickleback creates what I would call idea maps or protest maps using handwritten texts, largely in black and white, as you see here. These offer pretty pungent commentary on the extremes of contemporary life, and some of them include quotations from favorite artists. Stickleback's work, together with what you've seen earlier, Aloha's work, Hal Jones' work, the Made in Palestine images, but particularly this work, I think, vividly evidences how Peter provides each of his artists with a distinctive aesthetic, or looking at it slightly differently. Each time he wants to work in a different aesthetic, he creates the artist persona, the heteronym as it's called, the backstory to support that style, and then sends it out into the world in an ever rippling set of encounters. Stargazing, this is the cover of his book Stargazing, his memoirs of a young lighthouse keeper. For Peter, some of the origins of his interest in superfictions and psychogeography go back to his brief stint at the age of 20 as a lighthouse keeper on the west coast of Scotland. He later wrote this memoir, but at the time he was a lighthouse keeper, it was 1973. The Vietnam War was on, Watergate was happening. He'd been reading Jack Kerouac, and he was sitting there thinking about how one might go about crisscrossing the entire planet. And he formed the idea that there might be artworks in this approach. And from this early thinking emerged his constellation of globe-trotting artists and expansive institutions that, because they are not tied down to a single location, reach out across the globe in all sorts of unexpected ways. As Gordy mentioned before, COVID shut it down. Peter had been on a multi-year lecture tour. Notice that he's a billionaire, which is something all of us would like to be. The Fake News and Superfictions tour, which he sees as a kind of global derive, and he talks about many of the artists that he thinks of as superfiction practitioners, or what some of whom I would call fictive art practitioners. We're going to talk about how our definitions do and don't align, and the people we find inspiring and in this way. But this, sorry to say that the lecture tour did get shut down, but it may have a future life, so we will perhaps see it reemerge in a new form. There's obviously a lot more to say about an artist with this long and complex an oeuvre, but I think it's really time to hear what Peter has to say. So I want to begin by going all the way back to Peter's PhD thesis of 2000. So Peter, I'd like to ask you about this moment when you were thinking about superfictions so deeply and beginning to theorize them yourself. What got you thinking about this kind of art practice based on deception at that point, and wanting to write about it and landing on the word superfictions to describe it?
Okay, well, thank you, Antoinette. That was terrific, and that was a far better introduction to my work than I could have done myself. So thank you for that. And I think the PhD, which really went from 1996 to 2000 at RMIT University in Melbourne, that I really see that as the midpoint, so that a lot of things happened before that, and a lot of other things have happened in the 21 years since. So I could, maybe going right back to the beginning, to about the age of 3, I could sketch in very quickly 6 or 7 different events that led up to me making what I myself originally thought were these kind of strange artworks, and nobody else was doing this type of work. So I was probably 3 or 4 years old when an older friend in Glasgow, who used to tell these incredible lies or tall stories that I never knew whether they were true or false, told me that Father Christmas didn't exist. And whereas my parents, who always told me the truth, told me, no, he's wrong, Father Christmas does exist. So from that point onwards, I was always unsure of what was true and what was false. And the same friend, bizarrely, and this maybe goes into avatars and alter egos, the same friend's father, his actual name, I think, was Alexander Duncan, but people called him Cran Duncan. I didn't know where the Cran came in from, but he was also the tipster for Glasgow's main newspaper, the Daily Record, and had to go under the name of Gary Owen. So I had this kind of person in my life from an early age who seemed to assume different identities and be quite happy with it. And then we move on, and I started art school in Dundee, Duncan of Jordanson College of Art, and a good friend of mine, Stephen French. In first year, he and I invented a student, we signed him in every day to art school, as you had to do in those days. We sent letters and packages to the art school. And I only remembered this the other night, in fact. And so we created this fictional persona that caused all sorts of problems when the time for examinations came around and nobody could find this student. And but even then, I was becoming interested in the gap where the light gets in, if you like, between written fiction and visual artworks. And when I was given an essay to do by the Complementary Studies Department, as it was then called, for example, I created this fictional situation where an MP had supposedly lost a briefcase with a lot of secret information in it in a taxi in London. So my final essay was an old briefcase I bought in a charity shop, and I put different papers inside it and so forth. So that was probably 1971. And then after I worked on the lighthouses, I moved down to Guildford in Surrey, and in 1974. And that's a separate, much darker period where I was almost blown up in the Guildford IRA pub bombings and suffered, I suppose, a bit of what we'd call post-traumatic stress disorder after that. I was about to walk into the pub before it blew up and changed my mind, partly because I still had long hair at the time. And I remembered I'd been in that pub the week before and it was full of what I thought were skinheads. But of course, it turned out they were all off-duty soldiers from the barracks at Woking and Aldershot, which is why they were an IRA target. But that became a very, very dark sort of superfiction, in that the police had someone quickly. It didn't matter if they were guilty or innocent, so long as they were Irish. And so the so-called Guildford Four, who couldn't change a car tire, let alone construct a bomb, were arrested and served 14 years in prison for a crime that they didn't commit. And that was through falsification of police evidence. So that showed me the dark side of how truth can be manipulated, whether it's the IRA or Boris Johnson. And then moving on from that, a couple of years later, I was studying fine art at the same art school, but in Farnham in Surrey. And for my final year honours thesis, I created a group of fictitious artists called the Avant-Gardians. And there were were about 10 of them, I think, and I speculated on what sort of artworks they might be creating 10 years into the future. And I did fictitious interviews with them. And I began to think that maybe I could create, for example, a feminist art critic interviewing a couple of gay artists like Gilbert and George, and what would the Socratic dialogue be like between those three people, and how would you build on it and use it to explore different things. So that was 1976, 77. And then by the 80s, I was still trying to work as an artist, edit and publish an art magazine, Alba, from Scotland, which was half Scottish and half international. And I was also still writing for Art Scribe magazine in London and Art Monthly and Studio International. I still had this idea in the back of my mind that perhaps I'd like to continue this idea of art and fiction. The term superfictions I'd still to come up with, but my initial thought was to produce a fictitious art magazine so that I could have these invented artists that I would invent, and I'd also invent the art critics who interviewed them, but possibly also the art collectors as well who bought their work. But I was having so much trouble keeping a real art magazine alive, as most art magazine editors and publishers do, that I put the whole thing on the back burner for a couple of years. And it sort of came to me in the middle of the night. And Thomas Kuhn, and at one extreme, I'm very interested in the philosophy of science, Karl Popper, Thomas Kuhn, Paul Feyerabend, and Margaret Masterman. And famously, Thomas Kuhn said that large paradigm changes often happen in the middle of the night in a mind immersed in deep crisis. And then you wake up and you've got the solution. And that sort of happened with me. I suddenly thought, wow, instead of producing a fictitious art magazine, why not produce a fictitious press release and make it for a very large museum? And in fact, once I got to that stage, I thought, well, let's make it the biggest new museum in the world. So it would be sort of fanfared and highlighted a bit like the Bilbao Guggenheim when it appeared on the scene, except the Museum of Contemporary Ideas was much bigger, and had its billionaire benefactors, Alison Abner, Bucky Cameron, who I slightly modelled on the Armand Hammers and the Paul Gettys of this world. And yeah, so it sort of grew from there. And I think the other part of your question, Antoinette, was about the naming of superfictions. And
yeah, I'm more interested in how you settled on that word, superfictions.
Yes. In 1989, when I started sending out these press releases globally, and I'd send them to Reuters and Associated Press and all the major newspapers, as well as museums and artist friends, and they'd disappear into the post boxes, and I'd never hear until much later what effect they may or may not have had. In a sense, I didn't want an academic sounding word, because as an artist, I'd always been annoyed by the way that minor art historians had often named art movements and got it wrong. For example, Impressionism's not about impressions, and Cubism's not about cubes, but somehow that becomes accepted. And I'm more interested in the word glimpse than in the word impression. You know, but we don't talk about glimpsism, but Impressionism's got this about being often monetized and so forth. So I preferred art movements named by their participants, who may not always have been artists, visual artists themselves, but the Cobra group, for example, which was taken from the capital cities of the main members. So CO for Copenhagen, BR for Brussels, and A for Amsterdam. So it brought creativity into the naming of an artwork rather than a sort of academic title. And Dada, pop art, surrealism, Fluxus, Situationist International, they all seem to have a spark about the same sort of creativity you'd find in their artwork was in the title of their movement. So
you know, Peter, superfiction, the word super tends to suggest something bigger and more expansive, but also it evokes the world of comic books and superheroes. Were you deliberately trying, since you didn't want to be academic, were you using the prefix super to kind of glom onto that more populist imagery that comes with superheroes and super fans and superstars?
Yes, a little bit of that. I hadn't till now thought of superheroes as a source for that, but probably the idea that you mentioned originally of more than literary fiction, but spreading a certain fictive way of thinking into other areas. And I was thinking a lot about logos as well, and how the name of the art movement might appear, in fact, a little bit like a logo, if you can see that, where the superfiction is the sort of thing you might find on the side of a racing car, perhaps, but done in a tongue-in-cheek way also. And I think it's important to say at that time I thought I was a lone individual and nobody else was doing things like this. And then an artist friend, Alf Lohr, who was studying at the Royal College in London, I met him one day and showed him my fictitious press releases in 1989, and he said, "Oh, you should really meet Res Ingold, a friend of mine, a Swiss artist based in Cologne. He's got an airline called Ingold Airlines." And I thought, "Oh, that sounds great," you know. So now this relates a bit to doing a PhD, where traditionally you would do a library search and you would sort of do it in the library and look for what's been published. But when I started thinking of doing a PhD, I realized nearly all the artists I was writing about, not only was there nothing about them in art magazines, certainly no books about them, and even very few catalogues. So the way I began to gather information was to go on global lecture tours, which were a bit like a derive, and linking also later on to what I might talk about adventurism. So you go on adventures and travel in the making of an artwork. So one artist led to another, and in 1989 I went to the Cologne Art Fair the weekend the Berlin Wall was coming down, and I was very tempted to leave and actually catch a train to Berlin just to witness this great historic moment, but I stayed in Cologne, and I was wandering around the art fair, and this also relates to the ideas of camouflage in animal behaviorism, but also to display, the two opposites. And in an art fair, which most of us have probably been to, you've got hundreds of booths showing a total variety of artworks, and no one booth really links to another one. And even within a booth, you get such contrasts. So the art fair booth has become my sort of framing device, in the way that a frame around a painting becomes a framing device. And I was wandering around, and there was a Giacometti there, and Marlene Dumas in another stand. And then I got to I got to an airline stand. It said Ingold Airlines, and there was a guy with a black suit and a red tie behind the desk. And it didn't yet click with me what my friend Alf Lohr had told me, but I thought, this is very odd. I know these convention centers like they have in Los Angeles. One week it's a event, when it's a leisure event, and then it's an art fair. And I initially thought maybe it was an airline fair the week before and somebody had left their stand up, but why was there a guy sitting behind it? So I queued up to talk to him, and then it clicked that, this must be Res Ingold with his fictitious airline. And I had my tape recorder with me, as you did in those days, and we immediately clicked. And he was the only other artist I'd met at that point who was doing something similar. And there were similarities, like he produced a business plan for Ingold Airlines, and it was in black and white with red spot color, as graphic designers call it. And my press releases were in black and white with red spot color, mimicking real press releases.
It was a very popular spot color in that period, red. It was very the easiest way to achieve a dramatic effect with spot color. Yep.
Just one red. And then about 4 years later, orange became the spot color, and that became the one of advertiser's choice. But so Res and I really hit it off together. And I could understand why I was creating a fictitious museum, because I love art, and a museum was like a container for lots of art ideas. But why would you want to create a fictitious airline? So that's the first thing I wanted to ask him. And he said, when he was a child, he had an uncle who had a light aircraft, and Res became obsessed with it and had daydreams of running an airline empire like Richard Branson, perhaps, but realized he didn't have the financial skills to do that. But he thought maybe through fiction, I can create my own airline. And back in 1989, he was doing things with his fictitious airlines, like having gymnasiums on them that happened 10 years later in the real world. So, yeah. Sorry.
No, I was just saying that that's not the only fictive airline, right? That's been developed partly to take the place of something that couldn't otherwise happen, because there's obviously Airplane Pain in my book as well, who developed an airplane company for a different set of reasons. But there's a kind of interesting urge towards realization of what seems to be the impossible in some of these projects. And you take it so very far with so many invented artists and institutions that one of the things I find myself wondering, Peter, is, do you lose track of their stories? How do you keep track of who's where and what they've done and which art belongs to whom? It seems almost as though you'd need an entire archive an archivist to keep track of everything at this point, because there's several interconnecting novels worth of material here.